Hey guys, Mr. T here for another ranking video. So we're going back to video games, but not to Pokemon. Today we are ranking the 9 generations of video games. And then I'm going to show you which console was my favorite from that generation. So for those of you who don't understand video games too much or don't know the history, we are currently technically now in the 10th generation of video games. The Switch 2, which launched back in June, started that 10th generation. And then Sony and Microsoft will more than likely follow up with their own console sometime next year. I think it was Sony that confirmed it's going to be next year. And Microsoft just released their handheld, or they released the trailer or the specs to their handheld console that they're going to start doing, thinking that they can match Nintendo in handhelds. Now, these 9 generations, 10 technically, but we're really only on the 9. I made a video a few years back about the history of them, so if you want to go watch that one first, go do that, because I'm going to assume you've already watched that, or you know about the generation of games going into this video. So, I am ranking the 9 generations based on how I feel they impacted the gaming community the most, right? So some of it's going to be a little nostalgia personally, but most of it's going to be based on what that generation of games did for the gaming field or the gaming world as a whole, basically. Now, my absolute favorite choice, my number one, that one is going to be a little biased because that one is just my personal favorite. That's why I put it at number one. But it does still hold up. Like, it still is a top 3, maybe even top 2 generation anyways. I just put it number one because it's personally my favorite. And it was also back when video games were... It was before video games really went down the rabbit hole of the money and pay to win and EA and all that stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in now. Generation 1 and 2, I did not put my favorite console on there because that was well before my time. I played consoles and games from both those generations, but that was well before my time. I'm not as old as some people think I am. So let's go ahead and dive in. So my least favorite generation of games is Generation 4. That was the SNES, so the Super Nintendo, otherwise known as the Super Famicom in Japan. The Sega Genesis was a big part of that. That's that middle one there. And then the PC Engine 16-bit or whatever it's called, that was the first console. So you can see the little arrow. I'm going to do that in each video. I'm going to point to which one was the first console. So that 16-bit one is basically they took a computer hard drive and put it into a home console. Now, the reason this one's my least favorite is because we went from 8-bit to 16-bit. So that means the graphics got better and there was a lot of, better sound and things like that. And the systems could do a little more. But it wasn't this revolutionary thing. Generation 4 really didn't do anything new or groundbreaking from Generation 3. Like, it did up some things and made some things a little bit better, but it was more of a general improvement than a whole, industry-changing thing. So that's the big reason why I don't really put Generation 4 very high. It really didn't do much. Plus, we were still kind of just recovering from the video game crash of the early 80s, and I'll talk about that when we get to Generation 3. Because Gen 3 is what pulled us out of that crash and saved the video game industry. Now, my next one, my favorite one for this is the SNES. I kind of basically grew up on the SNES in my early days before I got my Nintendo 64. That was one of that and the NES were the consoles I played the most at my grandpa's house whenever I went to it to visit. I've never played the 16-bit. I've seen it played before, but I have played the Sega Genesis quite a bit when I was younger. Now, my next one, my number 8 choice for generations. This one might get a little flack because it's a much newer generation, and that would be Generation 8. That's the Wii U launched it, and I'm going to get very controversial for some people here when we get to the Nintendo Switch, but I'll get to that later. Then we had the Xbox One, and then we had the PlayStation 4. Now, don't get me wrong, the PlayStation 4, that's the reason I felt weird and bad going so low on this list. The PlayStation 4 did a huge increase for the gaming community. It did so much for video games. I mean, the power, the hard drive, and again, this is when we start to get real, the digital era of gaming. This is when streaming becomes a big part of it and all that. But the consoles themselves, I mean, the Wii U is literally one of the crappiest systems ever. They literally should have just added the handheld to the Wii with like a software update or something. The Xbox One is a trash console compared to the 360. The 360 was so much better, and the Xbox One, the only good thing about it was you didn't get the red ring of death as much. You still got it, but not as much, and it was backwards compatible. Like, that's the only thing Microsoft's ever truly been good at over PlayStation has been the backwards compatibility. So I just feel like this generation, it did a lot on the side, but it didn't do much for like streaming and all that came out, but and that wasn't necessarily video games. Video games just got pulled into that stuff. So this generation saw a bunch of improvements around it, but not in it, if that makes sense. And that's why I put it so low. And of course, the PS4 is my favorite from this generation. The PS4 is one of my favorite consoles of all time. Okay? Now, for my next one, I'm probably going to get a lot of flack for this because this one is super low. But my next one is Generation 9, the one we are currently in. Well, technically, we're ending 9 and beginning 10. So the first console for this was the Nintendo Switch. Now, here's where I'm going to get controversial, and I know some people are going to fight me on this, but I will stand my ground. I'm going to die on this hill. The Nintendo Switch was not a Generation 8 console. It was the console that started Generation 9. There are so many people out there who argue that the Switch was the last console of 8. No, the Wii U was Nintendo's console in Gen 8. The Switch began Gen 9. It was stronger, it could do more, and it was ahead of some of the Gen 8 consoles. Some, not all. It was its own brand new thing. It launched Generation 9, and it stayed true well through the entire generation. It came out 2 to 3 years for the PS5 and the Xbox One, or Series X, I mean, and it stayed true all the way up until this year. So the Switch is the start of Generation 9, and I will die on that hill. And then, of course, we have the Xbox Series X and Series S, and then the PlayStation 5, okay? Now, the reason this one is so low is because, again, don't get me wrong, these consoles were huge improvements from their Gen 8 counterparts, but we're starting to see a trend in the gaming world where I don't like. I'm not a fan of these hardcore streamers making online gaming just impossible. And I know so many people are going to agree with me on this, and there's going to be those few that are like, oh, just get better. You know, how can somebody come home from an 8, 9, 10-hour shift at work, hop online and just want to relax and have fun, and this sweaty streamer who spent 12 to 15 hours that day alone, who plays all his time, and that's all he does, he's basically a Major League gamer, comes into the same match as him. Like, they need to start separating out these groups of people. They need to start adding more fun, casual, all that stuff. Because I had my day when I was, the sweaty gamer. I've won tournaments. I've won COD tournaments, Halo tournaments. I was ranked in the state. Okay? Technically, I was ranked nationally in Halo at one point in my life. So I've done all that. But I'm now a father, and I have a job, and all this. I can't play 16, 17, 18 hours a day anymore. I'm never going to keep up with some of these younger guys. I mean, Ninja himself made it very clear. The older you get, you're never going to be able to keep up with the younger generation. And Generation 8 and now Generation 9, they're the problem. We're pushing the online competitiveness so much that you can't even play for fun anymore. That's why I haven't played an online competitive game in like 2 or 3 years. The closest I've come to online play, I played Marvel Rivals here and there, but I played in the more for fun the fun modes. But I played Helldivers. That's it. I don't play online games anymore because of that. And again, I don't mind a challenge every once in a while, but there's a challenge and then there's a flat out you're going to lose. And in this case, again, even some of my former esports students are starting to get it. You know, even they're like, wow, yeah, I see it, you know? So that's what Generation 9 and 8 are doing to the industry, and it's killing things. Plus the pay to play, or the pay to win, I mean, you know, EA, all this crap. I love video games, and I will never stop playing them, but there's a lot of problems, and the industry is going down the wrong path. And this is the generation where it got the worst. Generation 8 is where it started. Technically, it started in Gen 7, but Gen 7 still had the goodness of it. Now, my favorite console is the PS5. I just love this thing, the games on it, and it is finally the first Nintendo, or the first Sony console that is fully backwards compatible. I know the PS3 was backwards compatible for a bit. I mean, you could technically play PS1 games on the PS2 depending on how you did it, but the PS5 can play pretty much every PS4 game. That's the one thing is I've never been a fan of Microsoft over Nintendo or Sony. The one thing Microsoft has always done right, though, is backwards compatibility. That's the one thing I like about the Series X. I can still play my original Xbox games on it. Okay? Now, my next two, I didn't mark a favorite console because, well, I already explained that. So my next one, so this is my number 6 favorite generation, and that is the first generation. This one gets above 8 and 9 because this is what started it all. The Magnavox Odyssey, which is that one at the bottom there, that was the first home console. The one on the left is the Pong systems. There were so many Pong games that came out during this time. And then that one on the right is Nintendo's TV Color Game Con or whatever it was called. I can't even remember. But this is what started it all. This is what brought games from the supercomputers and the arcades and everything into our homes. And it has reshaped the world. You don't have to be a video game fan to understand how big the world of video games has become. Video games has become bigger than the movie, TV, and music industry. You can go look it up, and it all began here. Now, my number 5 generation is Generation 2. Right? Now, the big thing about Generation 2, the reason Generation 2 gets a bump above Generation 1 is Generation 1 began the whole thing. I get that. But Generation 2 is when we start to introduce cartridge gaming. This is when you could actually start changing out your games. Generation 1 were one and dones. If it didn't have it built into the game when you bought it, or the console when you bought it, that was it. You couldn't do anything. This you could. You could even start adding controllers, and this is when we start to get the ability to start adding some more attachments and stuff. They even started making some video game consoles as computers, not PC gaming. They were consoles first, then they added on some PC stuff. And that one there on the left, that is the Atari. It's the Atari 2600. That's the stereotypical one. That's the one most people, if you were to say Atari, that's the one most people know of. They know the little joystick and the button and all that. So that's why Gen 2 gets so high up on the list. All right. Now, for my number 4 generation, that is Generation 6. Generation 6 had a lot going for it. This is when we see the introduction to DVDs, which means games could be bigger. This is when we start to see online gaming. So this is when it actually first started, back before it got, the crappiness of what I was explaining earlier. This is also when we get the PS2 and the Xbox, right? And the GameCube. I mean, the PS2, Xbox, and GameCube is probably the greatest trio in video game history, right? This is the one where I don't hate any of these 3 consoles. These 3 consoles right here are pinnacles of gaming. I loved all 3 of these. I had almost nothing bad to say about any of these 3 at the time. This is also when we really get introduced in handheld gaming. I know the Game Boy and then the Game Boy Color came out in Generation 5, but Generation 6 is when it really took off. It's where we then get the Game Boy Advance, the Game Boy SP, and we eventually get introduced to the Game Boy, or to the Nintendo DS. So Generation 6 rechanged the game in so many ways. This is also the second generation in a row where Nintendo was not the top dog. So Nintendo was the most dominant gaming company in the world. And if we come back one screen or a couple screens to Generation 3, I don't know why it's not on there. Actually, Generation 3 is not up yet. I'll talk about that later. But Nintendo was the dominant power in the gaming world. And then in Generation 5 and 6, Sony beat them out. And it's actually interesting because Sony and Nintendo actually got together to make a gaming console. Nintendo actually went to Sony and said, hey, can you build... Or Sony went to Nintendo and said, hey, can you build this? Okay? Nintendo backed out of the deal and went and made their own console, which eventually became the NES. And Sony was like, okay, fine, screw this. And Sony then went and created the PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2, and now they're the one true competitor to Nintendo. Microsoft has some great games, but Microsoft ain't nothing compared to the other two. Generation 6 is also the introduction of the big three. So this is the generation where we get the big three. I know Dreamcast is up there, and I mean, half of you probably never even seen a Dreamcast, but this is when we start to see the war between Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo, which are really the only major console brands left. I mean, before there were hundreds of consoles out there. Everyone was making a console. Nowadays, it's basically these three. There are some others, but no one cares about the others. Now, my favorite from this one was hard. I will say, Generation 6 was the hardest one, the absolute hardest one for me to pick my favorite, but it ultimately came down to the original Xbox. Again, all three of these, I was literally racking my brain with who to pick. I literally moved the green circle to all three of them at some point while I was making this presentation. I love all three of these, and I almost picked the PS2, and the GameCube easily could have been on that list, especially because of the Pokemon games and Super Mario Sunshine, which is the greatest 3D Mario game of all time. I will die on that hill. I don't care who says otherwise, and I'm looking at a specific former student of mine who graduated this last year who would always fight me on that. But Super Mario Sunshine is the greatest 3D Mario game of all time. I will die on that hill. Moving on. The reason Xbox got number one for me was this was my first real introduction into the gaming world. Before this, all I had was the Nintendo 64. That was about it. This generation, though, is when I went into overdrive on video games. This is when I had all three consoles. I got the handhelds and everything. And the thing that really won it for me on the Xbox was Star Wars Republic Commando and the Halo series. Right? Halo 1 and 2 is what finally swayed me towards the Xbox. Some of the greatest games of all time, and the Halo series is without a doubt, one of my favorite gaming series of all time. And that's what ultimately put the Xbox on top for me. Now, my next one is the Generation 3. Okay? I know I was bouncing back and forth and looking kind of dumb. Probably should have remade the video. I don't care. Generation 3. This generation gets a spot so high, and it gets to be number 3. And the biggest reason for that is because it saved the video game world. This is the generation that saved us. So in 1981, 1982, the video game market crashed. It was called the Great Video Game Crash of the 1980s. Nobody wanted gaming consoles because the thing is, in Generation 1 and 2, there were dozens of gaming consoles. I mean, people were making gaming consoles left and right, and the price of those consoles was like the modern equivalent of like $1,200. Now, don't get me wrong. I think the consoles nowadays are outrageously priced. They should be like $300, $400, maybe $500, depending on what they can do. But back then, I mean, they were charging like $600, $700, $800 back in the 70s. I mean, and video games back then was this niche hobby that no one really cared about. The other thing that we saw too was the arcade games were still very popular at this time. So home consoles really started to take a dip, and then by the late 70s, early 80s, it really started to fall off because a lot of these gaming companies started to basically die off. And I mean, even the arcade games were starting to die off. So then in 1982, Nintendo released the Famicom in Japan, which then was released in North America, and that's called the NES, which is the one I have, the first console. And that revitalized the gaming world. It changed up so many things. It started to streamline games, and it allowed third-party game makers to make games for all these systems, which was technically around before this, but not so much. This is where it really started to shine. And of course, my favorite console from this one is the NES. That was the first gaming home console I ever played was the NES. So this literally saved the gaming industry, and it allowed us to continue on to the great things that we have today. Again, the community of the video game world, and a lot of the industry still sucks, but the games today are still amazing. And gaming, when done right, is still such an amazing feeling, and this is where it was all saved. Now for my final two. My number 2 is Generation 5. The reason I put Generation 5 on here was a little bit nostalgia for me, but this was the introduction of CD-ROMs, and this is when we first get 3D graphics. So this is what opened up the world of video games to so much more, okay? Before this, we had 2D, side-scrolling, all that stuff. Now we have these open-world games that can be experienced through 3 dimensions. And it also gave us CDs or discs, which allowed us to create bigger and better games. So this generation revolutionized the gaming industry arguably more than any of the other generations. And of course, we have the staple of video games, which is the PlayStation 1, and then, of course, the Nintendo 64. Now, I know this is going to be super controversial, and some of you are going to think I'm crazy, but my favorite console from this generation was the 64. I technically didn't own a PlayStation 1 until after this generation. And the reason was, at the time, we weren't, we couldn't afford both consoles. We could barely afford the Nintendo 64. So my mom got me that for my birthday, and there was no way I was getting a PS1. Okay, it just wasn't going to happen. So my best friend had a PlayStation 1. So we were at each other's houses every day. I had the 64, he has the PS1. We were playing both all the time. So I played the PS1 almost daily or every other day during this generation. I just didn't personally own it, and that's why the 64 was better for me. This was also my introduction to Pokemon. The first Pokemon game I played was Pokemon Blue on my cousin's Game Boy Color. My mom then got me this console, and my aunt got me a Game Boy Color at the same time. So I was able to play both Pokemon, and this is where my love of Pokemon truly began. And those of you who know me know Pokemon is life. Yeah. Now, my final generation, my number 1, the one I love the most. And again, this one had a little more nostalgia going for it to put it up into the top than anything else. And that was Generation 7. Generation 7 was a huge upgrade. Not because it didn't like upgrade the CDs and stuff. What it did upgrade was better graphics. Okay, this is the introduction of HD graphics. It upped the power and the storage of the consoles, and it introduced things like motion controls, and this is the generation where online gaming skyrocketed, but it didn't quite get to where it is today. We don't have, we have the streaming community was small. You don't have those sweats who game for 15 to 16 hours a day who hop on and play with you all the time, and they're the ones that are always going to win. You actually had a community. And in this community, the Xbox alone, the Xbox 360, one of the greatest consoles of all time, by the way, the Xbox 360, games like Halo 3 and Halo Reach dominated not just my childhood, but the community was so amazing during this generation. I had friends on this that I never met in person, but I considered my best friends. There were people I played games with daily on these consoles, and the memories, some of my greatest childhood memories came from one of these 3 consoles, right? And these 3 consoles are the second greatest console lineup in history. The only thing keeping this down is the PS3. The PS3 was actually my least favorite of these 3 or this generation. And my favorite was the 360. I played that game I literally bought that one, the Pro, the upgraded version. I did the skins, I did the faceplates, I did it all. I went through like 6 of these Xbox 360s because of the Red Ring of Death. But it just, the nostalgia was so real during this generation. It changed my life. And this is the generation where video games went from something cool and I like to life for me, basically. And it's what put me on that path. It was also during this generation that I started college, and I was actually writing papers on the history of gaming during this generation. So, yeah. All right, ladies and gentlemen, so that's me ranking the 9 generations. The new 10th generation has just begun this year with the Nintendo Switch 2. And again, I will die on that hill. The Nintendo Switch 1 is Generation 9. It is not Generation 8. Fight me on that. So, as always, stay beautiful, Americans, and peace.